Hello. The next speaker will be Ona Leganovic, and she will present us an historical insight into radio communication and radio communication legislation. So without further talk, please have fun with funkerspuk.
Yeah, okay. The stuff I'm going to talk about today will by no means be complete or exhausting. In fact, I think there are quite a few people in this building that know much more about most of the topics than me. But so far, I haven't seen the kind of comparison I want to make anywhere before, so it will be interesting anyway. So what are those topics? Radio politics of days long gone, mostly the 1920s. Why are they of any interest? Well, I find them strange enough in themselves, but for anybody interested in current policies regarding communication technologies, this will be interesting too, because here you can find some roots of current policies, some debates that resonate to this day, arguments that were given for the first time, paradigms in the making. So first I'm going to talk about what happened in the USA, then I'm going to talk about what happened in the Weimar Republic. I plan to go a little bit more into the Third Reich and stuff, but that would be too much for 1 hour, so I cut it out. And then there will be some, more miscellaneous stuff about some ideas that I have, how this relates to current policies, but I decided to leave the real outlook more to the discussion because I think many people here will know much more about communications technology policies of today than I do. So that would be a good topic for discussion. So and then there are 5 questions to bear in mind maybe during the talk, and they are useful for not just understanding this talk, but understanding a lot of other stuff too. First question, what is regulated? The second, why is it regulated? Then, how is it regulated? Who regulates it? And maybe the most important one of all, who cares? After radio was invented at the turn of the century, the first people to put it to use were amateurs, of course, until they managed to make a living out of it, like Marconi, who was in 1901 the first one to successfully send a wireless signal across the Atlantic, who later built a near monopoly on wireless equipment that held till about 1912. And not just amateurs, but the military was on their heels. The US Navy starts to establish coastal stations and to outfit the fleet with wireless communication equipment in 1898. In 1906, the first international regulation is set in place by the Berlin International Wireless Telegraph Convention, which also deems the term radio to be more appropriate. 1909, the first amateur radio club is founded. What is important to bear in mind during this stage is we're not talking about broadcasting, but about two-way communication, basically. There is, at that stage, already a senator in the USA who tries to kill off amateur radio completely, but the bill he brings into Congress doesn't pass, and so they can go on playing. But the amateurs, and by this time there are already pretty many of them. In 1916 there are 10,000 licensed radio amateurs. They start to pose a problem to the public. That is, the public in the form of more, let's say, government organizations or anybody who deems his own communications more important than the amateurs. The problems are mostly interference because too many people try to send on the same frequencies, and prankster calls. There is a tragic incident you might all have heard about, the sinking of the Titanic. The tragedy for radio concerning the Titanic is there were two ships near enough to, who could have rescued people, but one of those ships was not equipped with radio equipment. The other ship, the radio operator was asleep. And then there were ships farther away who tried to still organize a rescue mission, but they could barely communicate because there was so much interference constantly and constant prankster calls. So they could not organize, they could not, that was one of the reasons that those rescue missions did not really do what they could have done otherwise. This provokes a public outcry in 1912 and the first kicking of radio legislation. The result of this legislation is not, it's not so much, it's barely the necessities of regulation concerning frequency bands, like the amateurs get certain frequencies so they don't interfere with the others. Different kinds of communication get different kinds of priorities so that emergency calls are not allowed to interfere with them or make pranks emergency calls anymore, stuff like that. Basically, this legislation tries to ensure that important messages really come through. And amateurs, amateur licensing is introduced. So, but this licensing doesn't seem to ever have been really a problem, differently than in Germany, we will later see. So, there's some mix-up here. For the beginning of broadcasting, of course, there's another major historic event, the World War I, which is a good focal point for radio amateurs because in the USA, radio amateurs are already in existence, and the Army can use their expertise, their education. They're there like a resource that only has to be tapped. There are some issues because during the war, the Navy seizes control of most of the radio stations and commercial radio communication stations in existence, and she does not really want to give that control back when the war is over, but she does not come through with that. So radio amateurs are not allowed to send during the war, but in 1990 all goes back to normal. Then in 1920, broadcasting starts. That's where we are now. And broadcasting is working like a landslide after KDKA in Pittsburgh, owned by Westinghouse Electric, covers the 1920 presidential elections. By the end of 1920, there are 30 stations broadcasting. In 1924, there are already 500. This, of course, brings more problems. More problems of the kind that, basically messages coming through gets difficult again. Too many people on not enough frequencies, no regulation at all in place. It's obvious that even if there are more and more stations going on the air, people will not be able to receive more because they're just interfering with each other all the time, and this gets really nasty. So the first radio conference is organized by Mr. Herbert Hoover, future president, by that time the Secretary of Commerce. This first radio conference is attended by about 30 individuals, persons in charge of broadcasting, politicians and amateurs, And I find it very significant, and I want you to bear in mind that here, where the important issues of radio legislation are debated, amateurs are, of course, invited in. One person counting as an amateur at that time and at that conference is Edwin Armstrong, yeah, who later got notorious. But the main issues Hoover wanted to address at that conference were public interest. Public interest meaning that, of course, it is in the public interest to be able to receive clearly. And yeah, second is who is to broadcast and to what purpose. And already there are complaints that direct advertising is to be curbed. The interpretation of these issues is mostly preventing signal interference, selecting quality broadcast programming, and thwarting censorship and ownership monopolies. There is a result in the form of a draft for legislation enabling Hoover to regulate monopolies and making broadcasting parties entirely responsible for programs carried. That is, quality programming is understood as not entailing, Gott, was heißt Beleidigung? Egal. Yeah, assaults and personal stuff, and yeah, so by making the programmers responsible, they try to address that problem. But at that time, this legislation does not come through because Congress has fear of placing too much control on Hoover's hands, and because this legislation lacked industry backing. Of course, the industry did not want to have Hoover able to regulate monopolies. But yeah, and another issue was how to pay for broadcasting. I won't go into much detail here. Basically, the listeners insisted on receiving for free, as opposed to a fee. The speakers, or potential speakers, wanted to make sure that they can access the airwaves, that they don't get shut down, shut out, whatever. And the broadcasters wanted a tax or a fee, if you want that way, because that would have made it much easier for them. They didn't want un-American views and distasteful material, that is, the right to decide what they want to send themselves. But yeah, at least with the tax, they did not come through. So the boom goes on. The regulation is still not in place, and of course, it gets more pressing. The next year, at the second radio conference, the interference problems have only gotten worse. Of course, more stations are on the air now. Partly, it's gotten worse because Hoover is not allowed to deny a broadcasting license if somebody applies for one, hindering reception, like everybody was standing on each other's feet and nobody getting anywhere. Special interest groups have started to crystallize, forming identifier groups like commercial entertainment broadcasters, by far the biggest, educational broadcasters, and amateurs. Yeah. And those groups are connected to different classes of broadcasting equipment. Yeah, mostly in regards to wattage, that is like how good and how far they can transmit. And so this second conference, the differently equipped stations get assigned different classes translating to different frequency bands. But because those equipment classes are not just equipment classes, but basically relate to those groups, different interest groups, this also is a judgment about the value of different kinds of broadcasting. That is, high wattage stations, mostly entertainment, get a comfortable zone. Educators and other small stations get pushed a little further away. And amateurs are now located so far out their frequencies are barely usable. At least it is believed they are barely usable. They are on the shortwave spectrum, And of course, later it turns out that the spectrum is pretty useful, but at that time it was like, oh, you know, far out there, nobody will hear you anyway. Yeah, Hoover moved radio services such as maritime radio, amateur radio, and government operations from the newly created broadcast band to other frequencies, while he divided broadcast stations into 3 groups, according to wattage. Like, now again, another quote. The position of what's called big business on this one. Yes. Yeah, okay. Big business meant good reception is possible if our lawmakers will allow the separation of broadcasting wave bands and will hush the individual who today ruins the entertainments of thousands by the operation of an antiquated or improperly adjusted telegraph apparatus. It's pretty clear that this is against amateurs. Like, the industry says, well, those amateurs, they're like nasty, they don't have proper equipment, they are only disturbing us, go make them away. Somewhat like that. And another issue comes up, an early patent war that is in, well, it's laughable like many of the patent wars we have today. Basically, the biggest companies that had to do with radio and broadcasting had cross-licensed each other to no end, so they could do anything and anybody else couldn't. But this patent war went a little further. AT&T had a patent on not just radio equipment, but using that radio equipment to broadcast entertainment and news. So people would buy broadcasting equipment from them and start broadcasting, not thinking of the possibility that they were infringing a patent just by broadcasting. AT&T tried to enforce that patent, but it was clear that this was a publicity nightmare because it just looked like AT&T wanted to shut down all the stations that would not pay a significant fee, and it was, yeah, it's hilarious. But to make sure that everybody understood that they are serious about it, they sue a station in New York, VHN, yeah, for not paying the fee. A press war enters while at the same time this cross-licensing stuff is investigated by the government, because if it constitutes monopoly. The complaint is dropped only in 1928. Yeah, the public clearly perceives this as an issue of censorship, but VHN curbs because it cannot sustain litigation. The case is settled. So AT&T could be rejoiced, but by 1926 this issue is dead because it's just not possible to communicate to the public why there should be, or what sense a patent on broadcasting entertainment makes. Then in 1924, the third radio conference is called in by Hoover, now attended by 100 delegates. There are new issues like establishing high power stations, controlling advertising, establishing a priority of broadcast material, and again, let's say fighting between the small and the bigger stations continues, but it does not, it's actually of interest to people. So the small stations tell their listeners that they should send letters to Hoover before that conference, and he gets 6,000 letters of listeners on behalf of small stations. It is said that Hoover tries to promote small stations, but knows most innovation comes from the big ones. So of course only the big ones are the ones interested in establishing high power stations, only they can pay for it. I won't go into the advertising issue much, and yeah, the establishing a priority of broadcast material is this question about like news and entertainment and education and what role each of these should play. The industry wants to get both pros for their high power stations and wants to get preferred treatment because they say they are the only ones capable of providing quality content because you have to pay for talent. They try to put away with the issue of censorship and sort out programming ourselves. And they start to develop long-distance networks, which is a specificity of the American system I will go into later on. Hoover's answer to this is there are three kinds of free for radio. One is, the broadcaster is free to broadcast what he wants, but another one is the listener is free to hear what he wants, like he does not. And this is a big issue at that time because radio is such an intimate thing because it comes into the home. So Hoover mainly says that because of this intimacy and because like parents cannot just shut out radio from the home, so whatever comes, the children will listen to it, there has to be a kind of caution. But there's another. Whatever. And yeah, government shall not regulate material. This goes through all the time. There is no direct censorship. Like stations are not allowed to, for example, let the candidate of one party to the air, but not of another one. They have to treat everyone equal if they pay, if they sell airtime. But direct censorship is more or less substituted for by fees. Fees are simple because if you just make the fee high enough, only the candidates of the bigger parties will be able to pay for it, and you don't have to think about the problem of maybe communists getting on the air or the anti-American sentiments we had earlier. And this is the way this is handled for, at least the time my lecture covers. But still, radio is booming and radio overcrowding becomes a problem again. While, that's an important point. Public interest is defined as entertainment because, people want entertainment, so this is a public interest. This sounds trivial now, but it will be much, much less trivial when we come to the Weimar Republic, where there is a completely different notion of public interest. So the fourth and last radio conference has 500 delegates. She promises program diversity brought to listeners by a reliable, corporately controlled radio industry. It did not hold, but people believed it. She still clings to the notion that self-regulation is better than government oversight, partly saying that, well, the big stations will act in the public interest because they need to have listeners, so they will do what listeners want and therefore serve the public interest. In all these discussions about radio legislation in the US, there are some recurring notions like the technocratic mindset, called so by Slotin, New complex electronic inventions like radio and television seemed mainly to involve problems of science and technology rather than fundamental issues of private property, democratic rights, or economic control. Therefore, most of the people listened to as experts in hearings and stuff were engineers. They believed they were the ones able to solve those issues. They believed they were completely rational and therefore able to do that. They did not think that maybe they could act in the interest of the firms they were, or the companies they were employed by. But this also meant that radio was left much to its own, and the real regulation mostly concerned stuff like frequency bands, etc. Yeah, another one is responsible free speech. What I said was, because the radio comes into the home, and the freedom not to listen is not really considered as one. If your choice is only to, well, either I like what the radio is telling me or I can stop listening to it, this is no real choice, or at least is not conceived as one. And there's a lovely discussion between advocates of an open discussion and advocates who say, well, we have to look after the public welfare. Same as public interest as pro-industry or versus diversity. And of course, connected to that, free speech and liberty, that is the repressionists who say, well, public welfare, we have to be careful what we let on the air, nothing anti-American. And the libertarians who are more afraid of people getting shut out of the airwaves. So, any questions so far? Okay. In Germany, things were completely different. Yes, very, very different. So, again, I'm going to talk about the very early things in World War I, and then the Weimar Republic, and then I'm going to lead over to a little bit of stuff about Third Reich, but not much. The one person whose influence is maybe comparable to Herbert Hoover in Germany is Hans Bredow. He was an engineer employed by Telefunken. Telefunken, a company was founded especially for the German military to advance radio technology, and one that is, of course, based in Berlin. There's still a very old small skyscraper named after them, in which now the German Telekom resides. But so Bredow takes up the competition with Marconi and gets to break it in 1912. He is the first one to broadcast music during World War I in 1917. That is right on the front for soldiers, of course, because at that time in Germany they are the only ones to receive it. And after the war, he gets to be the head of the Radio Broadcasting Commission that was established to advance public broadcasting in Germany. At that time, I don't have really numbers about amateurs in Germany. They must have existed, but not many. Nobody even mentions really that there were some. I can't imagine that, but that's how it is. That only changes in World War I, when 190,000 men are trained as radio operators. The army sends daily reports from Hauptfunkenstelle Königs Wusterhausen, so this can be seen as the beginning of broadcasting in Germany. But problems arose when the war was over. Namely, those men, just educated radio operators, did not want to stop being radio operators. like 190,000 men, theft of military property became a plague, and so did Missbrauch von Heeresgerät, that misuse of military property. Finally, during the November Revolution of 1980, just like other workers and soldiers, they formed committees and councils. They seized control of the Wolfsche Telegrafenbüro, by that time the biggest broadcaster for radio telecommunication in Germany. They use this to organize the revolution, send out communiques, messages, news, all this stuff. And they tried to establish a different kind of radio organization, the Zentralfunkrat. The Zentralfunkrat had believed that they were the one authority in Germany for broadcasting. This is too much, but and they they tell all the other broadcasters what they have to do. All the radio people, they say, well, now we are the ones, and this phenomenon is dubbed funkerspuk, and for the first time, the information broadcasting monopoly of the Reichspostministerium was questioned. Before that, there did not exist private radio communications companies like they did in the US. Everything was right under the thumb of the Reichspostministerium. The revolution fails and these ideas are shattered. There is a Reichsfunkkommission who's supposed to organize broadcasting in Germany, and where this Zentralfunkrat even gets a say, but it's just one of many groups that have a say there. And a year later, there's another organization, the Reichsfunkbetriebsverwaltung, and Hans Bredow comes into the picture again. So the Zentralfunkrat is not, it does not have any power after the revolution fades, so it sinks into oblivion. Hans Bredow is very important at that point because he's more right-wing person, so he likes order, and he is very energetic, and he makes sure that radio again comes under the thumb of the Reichspostministerium. There remains not much left of the Zentralfunkrat in the form German broadcasting has developed since then, but the fear of uncontrolled radio communication. Friedrich Kittler writes, I'm going to read this quotes, the German quotes in German, and you can look at them in English because I like some of the words so much that, I think the people who understand German should have the pleasure of hearing them in the original. Massenkommunikation, mit anderen Worten, wird erst zugelassen, wenn es alles zu konsumieren oder zu hören gibt und nichts mehr abzuhören. Rezeption ist nur ein Euphemismus für systematisch verstellte Interzeption. This alludes to the fact that the military managed to hinder the development of public broadcasting until they had enough encryption in place to not be afraid anymore on the one side, and on the other, that radio apparatuses that were allowed to go into mass production in Germany had to only be able to receive a very narrow frequency band and be absolutely not usable for transmission themselves. Information through broadcasting was not so much perceived as something democratic, something freeing from restrictions, but as something dangerous to governmental power and therefore to be tamed. So I guess I was a little bit early with this one. The strictly passive apparatuses. So, So after all these control issues are sorted out, broadcasting is finally established in the Weimar Republic in 1923 and is completely state-owned. And not just state-owned, but completely controlled too. Again, a German quote that I was not able to translate, but I'm going to tell you what it means afterwards. Eine allgemeine Freigabe der Benutzung von Empfangsapparaten zur Aufnahme beliebiger Nachrichten, wie sie in einigen Ländern erfolgt ist, in denen der Staat sich mit der Beförderung drahtloser Nachrichten im inneren Verkehr nicht befasst, hat seine großen Bedenken, denn es würde damit jedermann technisch möglich werden, alle in der Luft befindlichen Nachrichten abzuhören. So what the Reichspostministerium in this case is afraid of that, well, if you just let everybody free and receive radio messages of any kind, like it happens in other states, and this is a very clear punch in the direction of the US, well, then it would be possible for everybody to intercept every message. That cannot be. That has to be avoided. Yeah, there are still radio amateurs left over, but yeah, oh, I did translate it. I already forgot. Okay, here there is. But, it's just, yeah, one would think that this is what radio is all about, but not in Germany. So I have this quote from Kittler, who quotes it too. Friedrich Kittler, he wrote a whole article about rock music as misuse of military property. And as plausible as Kittler may sound, what he says does not apply for other countries as much as for Germany, which is kind of obvious by now, but it is quite telling that the newsletter character of radio and its exceptional potential to distribute news was clearly recognized, but the consequence that freedom of the press applied to radio too was not. The resulting non-private radio program was marked by a multitude of rules and subjugation under a censoring inspection authority. Entertainment and official news were allowed. Politics, widely understood as party politics, were not. This may sound harmless, but I want to go into more detail here. Yeah, this quote, im Original den Ansprüchen der Weimarer Verfassung entsprechend, war eine moralisch zu rechtfertigende Heiterkeit anzustreben. This is about entertainment. And another one. In Germany, nobody really cared what the public actually wanted to listen to. That is, man wollte angesichts der Konkurrenz der Sendegesellschaften und der allgemeinen Radio-Euphorie gar nicht genau wissen, was die Hörer wünschen. This is a clear difference to the United States, where the advertising financed big broadcasters, of course, made tests and everything and really tried to find out what people wanted to listen to, not in this case. And the other important point, the only entity allowed to use radio broadcasting for politics was the government. This means, it is strange because, you know, government usually belongs to a party, but party politics are not allowed on the radio. So there lies this strange notion that the government, regardless of to which party it belongs, will say the right thing, the important thing is the one to be listened to, and yeah. So, and entertainment, of course, in Germany, entertainment, what's that? It's like, you want to be entertained, why? So leisure is work. There actually are people that try to justify the broadcasting of entertainment, because when you listen to music and stuff when you get home from work, then you'll be less bored and better able to work the next day. This is a really important justification for entertainment in Germany. Yeah, some numbers. 10% of broadcasting time was dedicated to news and information, 30% to entertainment, and 60% to education. And this is really reversed to their popularity. There was one big inspection of like one time what people wanted to hear, and they were very interested in news. Of course, they wanted entertainment too, and education comes somewhere on the 10th place of I don't know how many, but and the interesting thing here is that those news are sent at times where only, let's say, the bourgeoisie is able to listen to them. So there is one news broadcasting at in the middle of the day, I guess about 2 o'clock, and there is another one lately in the evening about 11 o'clock, and these are either times where workers are in the factory or workers are sleeping. So this kind of makes sure that really only the right people hear the news. Nobody here should not. Maybe they could understand anything, I don't know. Yeah, this are the mainstays of Weimar Republic radio politics. There's a lot of legislation after that, but this stays in place, basically. Yeah, this was that. Then who cares? Well, in Germany, it really is only those who have to. Most decisions are made behind closed doors. There's no such thing as a public debate. And I cannot repeat this often enough. There is no such thing as a public debate. The public just, well, they're doing this, and they are the government, so they will be right. More does not seem to happen. No such thing like 6,000 letters to Herbert Hoover or anything. There just is no interest in it. Something like the patent war of AT&T and WHM would not have been possible or necessary in Germany at that time because, of course, the legal system is different, but AT&T basically had to drop that patent because of public interest, because of a public debate, because it was a public relations debacle. And where there is no discussion, a public relations debacle cannot happen. There's another typically German issue at this point. Germany does not only have very restrictive licensing for radio amateurs, but licensing for listeners. So in the first, 6 years of radio broadcasting, you have to apply for a license and get a stamp on your machine to just be allowed to receive broadcasting. And those first apparatus are pretty expensive. There circulate manuals how to build one for yourself. Of course, many people do that. But for licensing for listening, you have to pay. And many people don't. So there are some estimates that at one point or another there were millions of people, black listeners. And what to do about it? Well, you set a price for somebody who denunziert seine Nachbarn. Well, basically, if you tell 5 people to the police, that are black listeners, you get a prize of money or a real radio apparatus or something. And one student in Frankfurt am Main is said to have actually found and told the police about 1,500 black listeners. Stupid idea, but then there is the first German Funkausstellung, what I have included because, of course, the Funkausstellung still happens today, and some of you might have been there one time or another. There's more propaganda for licensing listening, and is more or less successful, but of course not in the millions. And in one sweet book of Heinz Pohle, I found this classification of broadcasting, ways to organize broadcasting. Pohle is interesting because he basically likes the German system, although he's really clear of his shortfalls. He knows completely what is wrong with it, but he's still of the opinion that, well, it was necessary. It had to be that way. Germany was just not, ripe enough for a real, unregulated broadcasting. So he says there's broadcasting as a private enterprise, there's broadcasting as a public institution, and there's broadcasting as a state-owned monopoly. And of course, those translate. In other words, the American, the British, and the German system. Yeah, those are my main book sources. Of course, there will be more in the net. Some last quotes. Again, from Heinz Pohle. This one I really have not translated, whatever. Der Deutsche Rundfunk im Weimarer Staate, seit seiner Gründung hoheitsrechtlich aufgezogen, wirtschaftlich und technisch abhängig von der Deutschen Reichspost, staatlich überwacht und bevormundet in seiner politischen und kulturellen Programmgestaltung, wurde nicht erst durch Neuregelung von 1932 ein Staatsorgan, sondern war als ein solches bereits in seiner 1926 erfolgten Konstituierung angelegt. What he says is, the German Broadcasting Organization was so much controlled from the beginning that when the Nazis took over, they really did not have to do much. All the censoring was already in place, all the controls were already in place, they just had to put their own people at the right spots and everything went fine. And another one, he tries to find reasons why in Germany it went this way. And he says, well, there were staatliche Überwachung, Scheu vor Verantwortung, Widerstand der insbesondere bürgerlichen Parteien. That is, governmental control. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for radio, this frightening thing, and the political parties were opposed to it. One of the consequences of this regarding amateurs was that although in the US amateurs were already in the 100,000s and not much later in the millions, amateurs in Germany stayed in the 3-digit numbers until after World War II. Really just a few hundred people being radio amateurs because they did not get much licenses, and the amateurs getting licenses were not given to individual peoples. Licenses for amateur radio broadcasting were only given to organizations like clubs, Vereine, universities. So no radio amateurs in Germany, still. So yeah, I have some stuff I can add, but I would like to have questions first, or Does this remind anybody of anything happening today?
I guess I'm a radio amateur, and I guess regulation of this radio stuff in Germany will be worse in the near future, and is getting worse, as there are less radio amateurs, and so it's more and more regulated again by the Bundesnetzagentur. So less waves, and any analog stuff has to be turned off by 2015, and as there are less radio amateurs, there is more regulation again.
Yeah, that's a point. It's funny because in the US, Herbert Hoover could not really do much against amateurs because he needed their support in Congress to get his legislation through. But here, where there are not many of them, you can do almost anything what you want. So yeah, I did not know that it's still that bad, but. Okay, anybody else?
I told you before that you can still experience some kind of really weird regulation where you actually do the license, but you don't get your number because somebody doesn't like you in the Bundesnetzagentur. Such things happen. And it's really, when you have a problem with the Bundesnetzagentur, you're not likely to get an amateur license. Just to mention that.
Anybody else? Okay, then I'm going to tell you a quick anecdote from a slightly different field. Originally, I was doing research about magnetic tape, not about radio. And the thing is, magnetic tape was to a high degree developed to and brought to perfection in Nazi Germany. Why? Well, in Nazi Germany, magnetic tape made it possible to really at least, or no, not at least, at last, completely control broadcasting. So every single thing that was sent over the airways was recorded on magnetic tape. Of course, that produced a big need for magnetic tape. The AEG and BASF who produced it were happy about it, and it was made sure that really in every broadcasting station there was a magnetic tape recorder and everything was documented. In the US, there was nobody interested in magnetic tape, at least, alas, not the radio stations, because at the time of World War II, the radio stations had established this networking system. So they made their money out of producing material and sending it over basically, telephone wires to other stations who would send it to and would pay for it. If there had been magnetic tape in the US, this networking system would have been completely useless, because then you would have been able to record the programs and just transport them and copy them, by God. So the American radio stations made sure that magnetic tape was not getting anywhere in the US while it was brought to perfection in Germany for similar reasons. But yeah, so finished, I guess.